writing was more important to me than necessarily than being a biographer, even though I have always been fascinated by lives of other people. And I believe very strongly in something that I found in a book by an early biographer, Gamaliel Bradford, who says we are all biographers from childhood, and that we're always comparing our lives to the lives of other people around us. It's different to become a biographer, but I think we all have that biographical impulse in ourselves, and that's what I was building on as I became a writer, thinking the curiosity about other lives and what we can learn from them.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors and GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs, the creator and producer of this book talk series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history, in this month particularly honoring women's history. Tonight we're looking at the lives of women, of biographers, of biographies, and also at family history. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event centered on the book After Lives, on biography and the mysteries of the human heart by Megan Marshall. Now for some background on tonight's guests, both amazing researchers and best-selling biographers of women. Megan Marshall is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, as well as the works Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast, and The Peabody Sisters, three women who ignited American Romanticism, a Pulitzer Prize finalist. She is the Charles Wesley Emerson College Professor of Nonfiction Writing at Emerson College and a recipient of the Bio Award, the highest honor given by the Biographers International Organization. Turning to tonight's moderator, Janice Nimura received a Public Scholar Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities in support of her work on The Doctor's Blackwell, a New York Times bestseller and a finalist for the 2022 Pulitzer Prize. We presented Ms. Nimura and this book in the American Inspiration Series in 2021, and it's really a delight to have her with us again. Her previous book, Daughters of the Samurai, A Journey from East to West and Back, was a New York Times notable book in 2015. Her essays and book reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Smithsonian, and the Rumpus, among other publications. She is currently a visiting professor of environmental studies at Wesleyan, not far from us here in Boston, down in Connecticut. We'll hear from Ms. Nimura in the second half of our program, but now let's get started on the main event. Welcome to you, Megan Marshall. It's great to have you here. Actually, welcome back, as you were with us last fall as moderator.
Here I am, yes.
Here you are. Welcome. As I said to you off screen, we so enjoyed, so many of us in so many groups I'm part of, we enjoyed your New York Times book review essay about the importance of research, your interest in handwritten letters and journals, which so many people that I work with are steeped in, and also you being a stickler for accuracy. For us lovers of research and facts, this was really great to hear, and truly we are like minds. So over to you and welcome. Let's get started.
Yes, thanks so much for having me, Margaret. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Janice afterwards. Thanks to American Ancestors and to the GBH Forum Network for hosting this event. After Lives is a very different book for me. One of the things I'm most proud about this book is that this image you see on the cover is a self-portrait of my mother, by my mother, that I didn't discover until researching her life for this book. My mother didn't live to read any of my biographies, but here she is on the cover of this new book, After Lives, which the title of it has several meanings. The most obvious one, and the one that's most relevant for introducing the book, is this is the book that I wrote after writing the three big biographies of Margaret Fuller, the Peabody Sisters, and Elizabeth Bishop. It was 2017 when Elizabeth Bishop came out. I had spent 30 years under the gun of deadlines for these enormous biographies, and I had had it with that. So I said to myself, where will my writer's imagination and curiosity lead me? One of the first places it took me in 2017 was to my own family, my own past that I had ignored while writing about other people's lives. This is a photo of my grandfather, my Marshall grandfather, my father's father, Joe Marshall. I had been fascinated by this in a batch of photos and letters that came to me after my grandparents' death. I was maybe some of you are like this, a designated person because I'm interested in history. All the family papers kept coming to me. I knew that my grandparents who lived near me, they were in Altadena. I grew up in Pasadena. Had lived in Paris during World War I, but I didn't know really much about it. And this photograph had kind of stood out to me. I assumed this was my grandfather in aviator's gear, heading out to, into the war in Paris. But that wasn't the case at all. I hadn't, he had, when I knew him, he was older. He'd been an insurance salesman through much of his life. And I knew he'd kind of suffered from depression. So I thought when I started looking into these letters in 2017 and 2018, which was going to be the 100th, the centennial of the armistice that ended World War I thought maybe I would find out that he had suffered shell shock. And that was the explanation for the man that I knew. But I found something really quite different. And we'll see the next photo. This is a photo that was not in the archive that I'd inherited um, from my family, but it was referred to in a letter that my grandfather wrote home in it must have been November of 1917. He had managed to get to Paris with my grandmother. They, like many couples in World War I, married under the pressure of war, but he didn't have to leave his wife. They managed to get across on the boat and they lived together through the war. This photograph he referred to in a letter home to his parents saying, maybe you've seen this photo in the newspapers of it was captioned, the first burial of an American soldier after the American Expeditionary Force had joined of the war. He said, I wasn't supposed to be in the photograph, but there I am, the second man in the front row. You can recognize me by what looks like a fur collar, but that's actually the sweater that my grandmother, his new young bride, had knit him for his birthday. I think he would turn 27, something like that, just before he'd gone out to, and so what it turned out was he had become as a young man, the head of photography and film for the press office in World War I, and he had escorted photographers and journalists out to the place where the first casualties had fallen. But in fact, he said in this letter, even though you're seeing in the papers this is the first burial, it's actually not, because of course there were no journalists there for that. So that was one of my little discoveries of many discoveries in this the first essay that I wrote after beginning on what became this book. It's not the first essay in the book, but it's called The Second Man in the Front Row. And it was my way of learning about my grandparents from their letters. Really a love story, not a story of, although there was loss and pain and fear, the bomb that dropped on the street corner near them, near their pension. But it was a great revelation to me to find out what their lives were really like and to put this together. The actual first essay in the book, we'll go to another slide, it has the title After Lives, and it has a different meaning to it, or a special meaning, which is this essay addresses the question of what happens in the minds of biographers after they've left a subject behind. So I had spent 20 years writing about the Peabody sisters, And I found that they didn't ever really leave my imagination. This photograph is one that I took in the late 1980s when I had a fellowship to go to Europe and track the steps of the Hawthornes. One of the sisters, Sophia Peabody, married Nathaniel Hawthorne. And actually, both she and her daughter, the eldest of the Hawthornes, died in England after Nathaniel had died in Concord. And this is a picture of their grave site, and you can see this beautiful flowering tree is a hawthorn tree. Um, I had never seen a hawthorn tree before, or really known there was such a thing, but this was planted in 1873 after Sophia died by her daughter Una, who then followed her, dying at age 33 in 1877. Let's go to the slide. We'll see here's Una Hawthorne, the oldest of three Hawthorne children. Um, she, shortly after I had finished the Peabody Sisters book in 2005, there was a move to bring Sophia and Una's remains back from England to be reunited with Nathaniel and reinterred at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord. And because I was known to the family and involved in that project, I was invited, and I'm not going to tell you what I found, but I was invited to be there when the remains were brought back from England. And I was there when at an opening of the casket. And what I found, let's go to the next slide. I'm not going to tell you what I found, but it has something to do with this lock of Una's hair, the bright red hair. And that's what that essay is about, Afterlives, trying to understand this mystery. Why had she died so young? A mystery that stayed with me and was revived by the opening of the coffin. So you can read about that in the book. Another essay, which again turned back to my growing up years in California, is this third meaning of afterlives, is a way of giving an afterlife to people who were known to me, who were influential in my life, who represented turning points where I became sort of headed towards becoming a biographer. This is Jonathan Jackson, a boy in my high school class at Blair High School in Pasadena. This is his sophomore year photograph from the yearbook, a yearbook that I carried with me all my life. Many of you probably also carry your high school yearbooks and you have stories to tell from them. We'll go to the next slide. Here he is, number 25 on the JV basketball team in also a little bit later in that sophomore year. When we were juniors, he was in my AP English and US history class. He was taking a tough chemistry class from a teacher I'd also studied with. And what you don't see in these photos, although you see the sadness in his eyes, is he's the younger brother of George Jackson. You might know of a book called Soledad Brother. George Jackson had been imprisoned for his role in a very petty theft when he was just 18, and George was almost 10 years younger than that, more than 10 years younger than that. So Jonathan, my classmate, had grown up with his older brother, his oldest sibling, in jail and never really getting to see him. And it was one of these sort of plea deals where supposedly he would get off, but he never did get off. And by the time we were in high school, George had become radicalized by the reading that he was doing in prison, like Malcolm X. And he was a target of the prison system and had a murder charge pinned on him just by circumstantial evidence. So now he was perhaps destined for a death penalty case. And this concerned Jonathan greatly, as you can understand. We'll see the next slide. Here's, he began writing for one of the underground newspapers at our school. And I had saved this all this time, April 1, 1970. Here's Jonathan's editorial for Iskra, a newspaper that took the name from Lenin's radical newspaper, underground newspaper in Russia, the Spark. Iskra means the spark. And he writes partway down, I am the only Black in my English, US history, and Algebra 2 class, and one of three in my chemistry class. I'm constantly being bombarded with such questions as, where did you learn that? And where did you get all this culture? All of the above questions come with a standard incredulous look. It's a fantastic document of that time, and really it could be written today. This is part of the message of this essay, which is to recall Jonathan, who 4 months after writing this, the summer before our senior year, took weapons that were registered to Angela Davis up to the Marin County Courthouse, took some prisoners who were on trial hostage and the judge, and hoped to exchange these prisoners, these hostages, for his brother, who was then at San Quentin prison. It didn't work out that way. Many of you know about this case. Jonathan was killed. The judge was killed. Angela Davis became a fugitive for some months until she was turned herself in, and a big headline case. She was finally let off from that. But Jonathan is lost in all of this, the 17-year-old who gave his life hoping to rescue his brother. And this is what my one of my essays, Free for a While, is about, trying to give Jonathan an afterlife. I'll touch on briefly, give you little morsels of two of the other essays. This one is a photo. You see a photo of me with my mother and my grandmother. This comes from an essay called Left-Handed. I grew up with both grandmothers, and my mother and my aunt were all left-handed. I thought this was a superpower of sorts. Until I began to realize, first of all, I wasn't going to grow up to be left-handed. I was right-handed, and that the left-handedness was a kind of obstacle for these women in a way, the same way that just being women can be an obstacle. And in researching, again, I had this trove of papers, my mother's letters, my grandmother's letters, and let's go to the next slide. Here's one from my grandmother writing. Again, this couple, my maternal grandparents, also married in the midst of World War I, and they were not able to travel together, but I have these wonderful letters that my grandmother wrote to her new husband. And here's one that I was just amazed to come across. She says, "Did I ever tell you that when I was born, my father didn't look at me for days?" Now, this was background or an explanation for our story. I had known that her father left the family. I didn't really know why. She didn't speak of it, but this letter revealed to me that it was simply because she was the second born, another daughter. The father wanted sons, and he left. It was very revealing and fed into this argument I was making in the essay about left-handedness, about the challenges that women face, that we're all thinking about in Women's History Month. And the last essay I'll mention, there are others in the book, but it is one a little more lighthearted called These Useless Things. And here it begins with my contemplating the ice pick that had belonged to my father. Arctic Ice Company, safe, sanitary, saving, it says. Why did I save it? I'm asking myself in this essay. Well, because it reminded me of my father, the times when he was in control of things, making ice cream, breaking up the blocks of ice to line the ice cream maker, that sort of thing. I'm not going to give you every step through these useless things, but it was also a way of thinking about the way objects are so important in telling stories of the past. And it concludes with my coming across, amazing to see, the Peabody Sisters writing desk, something that I had written about in my book, The Peabody Sisters, but I never really expected to come across. Now, here's what I knew about this desk: a Honduran mahogany portable writing desk, I learned. Elizabeth Peabody, to whom it was given. I'm writing on a writing desk, which was presented to Mary, her younger sister, and me by our scholars. It is one of the handsomest I ever saw. Everything convenient for writing. Let's look a little bit closer again. Here's it's inscribed. by their students. And we'll look at one more closer look. This is Melissa Carr, a furniture conservator who helped me try to understand about this item. Paper, wafers, inkstand, sand stand, a pen knife, which cost $1, an ivory knife to cut paper with, a silver pencil case with pencil in it. This was 1826, this desk. This was accompanied by a note, very affectionate, which I shall bring home to show you, she writes to her sister Sophia. How delightful it is, this overflowing heart of the young. How blessed is the employment which brings one in such close contact with it. This was the gift from their students. So I'm just going to conclude my presentation with reading a couple of paragraphs from this essay, These Useless Things, about the way objects stayed with me in memory and were so important in my childhood in ways that I think children today don't experience, because too quickly they're on the screens, or they're I don't know, they just don't have these things the way I had them when I was little, and probably many of you in the audience did too. So just to give you a flavor of the prose in this book. I don't remember living through the developmental stage at which young children explore the world by putting things in their mouths, but it must have been soon after that I discovered the joy of sorting, piling up, forming patterns on the carpet with the objects no longer useful or just waiting to be used that my parents offered me for play. There was the plain cedar button box with its exposed corner joinery I still have, and open now after years, stowed on a bookshelf next to my mother's college texts to see what's inside. On top, a cluster of yellowing cards bearing sets of 3, 6, 8 buttons of varied sizes and colors from La Mode, choice of smart women for more than 90 years. Le Chic, Jewel Tone, Pacific, True Craft, marked with prices ranging from 10 to 59 cents. Underneath, a rainbow of discs, the small C I remember sliding my hands into. I find tiny mother-of-pearl stars and fish, faux brass buttons with eagles and anchors, woven leather buttons that remind me of the hooded camel hair car coat I had in 7th grade and rarely took off, my shelter from high-stress social life in junior high. Sunk to the bottom, a scattering of what appear to be brown and black coffee beans affixed to metal hooks, shoe buttons from a distant age. A crumpled plastic baggie surfaces with the intricate turquoise knots and looped fasteners of the faded Chinese housecoat my mother wore all the years of my childhood as her art-making smock, making images like this. Why had she saved them when the fabric gave out? Because she had a button box, which became mine after her death 3 decades in the past. What I no longer possess is more vivid still, the cardboard box of ceramic tile samples in muted earth tones, cool to the touch, that I laid out as doll-sized walkways or floors of imaginary rooms on the gray living room rug. The Japanese box, whose inlaid rustic scenery split into 2 and then 4 cantilevered compartments, opening out to reveal bumpy beads of confetti-colored Murano glass and pale carved bone, smooth lozenges of amber, gleaming pink crystal globes with miniature explosions inside, my grandmother's broken jewelry. I never thought of the kitchens or bathrooms the tiles might have lined, the necklaces from which the beads had come unstrung. These useless things had no past or future. They were simply mine to handle and admire, in a way, to love. So now we'll have Janice come along and ask me some questions. I'm looking forward to that.
Hello.
Welcome.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me along, and thank you to American Ancestors too. So we are blessed tonight with an audience full of people who know what it means to look into the past via documents and try to put stories together. And my first question has to do with the turn that you made from deeply researching long lost people very dead people from long, long ago. In the case of the Peabody sisters and Margaret Fuller, less so, of course, with Elizabeth Bishop, who you knew. But when you're researching your own people, talk about the difference between doing archival research among the transcendentalists from another era and exploring documents that are in your own closet that are connected and often written by people that you knew who are your kin. How do you read documents differently when the writers are people that you knew?
Well, I was lucky to have had that background because I think the feeling of being a biographer gave me a kind of safe space from the high emotion that you might otherwise feel in reading these documents. Reading that your grandmother's father, wouldn't even look at her. That's very shocking. And I think if I hadn't gone through reading so many papers that had equally, if not more, shocking material in them, I might have been floored by that. But it still is, and I'll have to say, at least some of these documents, because I had to downsize, I had given them to archives. So there I was. That was another kind of spooky but a wonderful thing. I was reading my own family's papers in the same archives where I had sometimes researched the subjects that I wrote about. And so, the experience that I'd had before was a guide for me and protected me from the high emotion. But I still, a number of times just had to stop and leave the archive and process what I had come across, because of course I'm finding out not just about my grandparents, but therefore about me. And I knew, for example, in the case of that line about what she went on to say is, I really hope my grandmother, I really want to have sons, because if I don't have sons, she was terrified that her own husband would leave her in the same way. And I knew, lucky day, their first child was a son, but then they had a daughter, my mother, who was not particularly beloved by her mother for that very reason. And this passed down, I became very close to my mother's mother, but she, I think, felt lucky she had her father there to make up for this mother who really favored the older brother. These things happen. And then I knew why. I knew why.
Was it difficult to sort of filter out what you already thought you knew about people, or the stories that had been told to you about these people by others? Was it hard to get straight to what you were seeing on the page from their hand?
That's a good question. But that was also not, as I'm thinking of it, as I recall, again, sort of my memory might be shaped by what I want to remember, but I would say it was more like, well, there are things that I didn't know that I was surprised by. For example, I learned that my father was named this sort of funny family name, Woodbridge, after after a cousin who was born just before him died as a child. And I didn't know that before. But I wasn't shocked to find it. But it was, that's why that name was there in our family and continued to be passed down to my brother, that sort of thing. I guess I didn't find, and maybe there's something about wanting to be accurate and wanting to be truth tellers. I didn't find flaws in what people had told me. I just found things I hadn't known before. And in the case of my mother, that left-handed essay becomes a story about her career as an artist and where it went and where it didn't go. And I was, I had the same feeling actually in reading, studying the Peabody sisters. People would say, well, some people would say, don't you feel it's wrong to be reading their letters? These were private letters. But I said, they've left them for a reason. They've left them to shape this story. And I felt the same way with my mother. She had left these for a reason. She wanted someone to know what she had experienced. And, even the most very difficult things in her marriage, they were documented there. She wanted us to know. And then it was for me, I mean, maybe she didn't have the sense that this was a shaped life, but the documents gave me a shaped life to tell.
That's interesting that you use the word shape, because I think one of the things that we as biographers have that's most challenging is what shape, where does the frame go, right?
Yes,
You have a story, you have lives. How do you place the frame? How do you decide where to start and where to stop? Because lives, of course, spider out in all kinds of
they do.
directions,
They
and
do.
a biography is never just about one person. Um, so does the act of framing change when you go from biography to something that is more like memoir?
Well, I have this illusion, I think, and it might be an illusion, but it's a useful one that the documents tell me the story. I'm not going in imposing on it. I just, I knew I wanted to write about left-handedness, but I didn't know what I was going to find. I found out a lot about left-handedness, for example, and that the left-handed pair of scissors that the women in my family were so excited to open under the Christmas tree one year. In researching those scissors, I realized that was the last year I spent home for Christmas. So, that became a story. There was a frame. There was that I wouldn't have, something else would have popped out to make the story if it wasn't that, I think. I feel that I come to this work as a writer, I guess.
Mm.
And it's not that I'm going to distort things, but it's sort of just, like writing an English paper. You're writing a paper about hand imagery and, Macbeth or something like that. And you'll look for all those references. And it's that kind of brain that I've taken into writing other people's lives, looking for resonances and repetitions. But I'm not making them up. They are there. And
Mhm.
I think that's what helps me I'm going as a writer. I'm not just, you know, I want to find out everything possible. Of course, I do want to find out everything possible, but from the beginning, I'm looking for the resonances
Mhm.
and the
And
scenes.
are there ever resonances that you choose to exclude because they cut too closely to something that feels too personal to express when you're writing memoir instead of biography?
Well, there were many disturbing things I mean, as I say in the book, my parents they were deeply in love, but an unhappy marriage because of mental illness in my father's case. And there was a lot of documentation about that, things that I hadn't known, a confrontation with my father's mother present and, this recorded. But they didn't really have a place in that narrative. I kind of summarized that sort of thing. I didn't need to go into that scene. I
Right,
might in some other piece of writing, of course, but
right.
because I think it's quite remarkable.
Hmm.
Um, but if I left things out, it wasn't to distort a truth. It was because enough already.
Oh, yes. The best advice I've ever had as a biographer is just leave out all the boring bits. So, so let's shift from what do you do when you have more than you need to what do you do when you have not enough? So, what do you do about holes? What do you do when you find when you're writing about the Peabody sisters and you
Mhm.
find a gap? There's one set of techniques that you use to kind of finesse around the hole in the documentation. You can talk about other things that were happening. You can talk about what it was like then there in that time for other people. Um, is it different when you're writing about your own
It's a
past
good
and you hit
question.
a
I think
hole?
I may have done something similar to what I would have done in a biography. I think about the Jonathan Jackson essay. My mother happened to work for the city planning office at the time and was making maps of the racial composition of the different blocks of Pasadena because there was a move on, and which was successful, to do one of these redevelopment projects, which ended up decimating the Black neighborhood in Pasadena, many people moving to Altadena, and we've now heard how the fire has wreaked havoc on that community, which I hope will be able to restore itself. But at any rate, I could tell I didn't know a whole lot about what happened in Jonathan Jackson's family between, you know, his brother's imprisonment and when I knew him in high school, but there was a lot that I could tell about Pasadena and race in Pasadena and a desegregation suit that was brought. The first Pasadena had the first busing order come down outside of the South after Brown versus Board of Education, and it was no better. Well, I guess it's a little better there than in Boston, but this was before the busing crisis in Boston, busing crisis in Pasadena. So I had all of that story to tell to amplify a very personal story. It was the personal that I wanted to go at, and of course, I also had my own story, which again kind of gave a contrast to Jonathan's story. So, yeah, I'd say I would do the same things. Context, find another narrative that is similar to draw on. But I think also gaps are kind of welcome, you know? Let's move the story ahead here.
Fast forward.
Right.
I'm seeing there's some interest. Some of our listeners are curious about how you find the material when you're looking at your own family. Did you contact other family members? Did you collaborate at all with
I
other
did
people who
for,
knew these stories?
all of these essays, particularly I spoke to classmates in the case of the Jonathan Jackson story, because he was not a close friend of mine. Others knew him better and were more involved in that underground newspaper, for example. The editor of it was helpful to me. And I hadn't really lived in Pasadena for a long time, but I did, ask my sister, do you remember it this way? Or in the case of the image on the cover, this really gorgeous portrait, which was a mystery, it appeared, my sister found it in her storage room in the basement, a bunch of, a kind of portfolio of pictures that my mother had done in college. We could only assume that she had since my mother's death in 1991. And it just happened she was going through that at the same time I was working on this essay. And she said, did you know about this? I didn't know about this. So, I think you reach out as much as you can. And I have cousins who, remember my grandmother and my grandparents. And so there was a lot of that. But I do, I was the one with most of the papers. And in fact, one of my father's sister she had inherited these papers initially and was just a neatnik. She was about to throw away my grandmother's diary from the first months in Paris and the early days of her marriage. And she said, well, it's private. It's a diary. It's a diary. You have to throw it away. But no, and now it's in the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe.
Wow. So you've actually archived.
Rescued.
Can you talk a little
Yes.
bit about the decisions to donate some of your own materials to archives? I think that's an extraordinary idea to kind
Yeah,
of.
well, I got to a point where I was just, partly I was moving, I needed to downsize, but I also, these things were precious and I didn't really trust myself to, keep them safe. And the Schlesinger Library, which has Angela Davis's papers and it has Julia Child's papers and, just amazing, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. They also very much like papers of ordinary people, ordinary women, diaries in particular. I also gave to them the first thing I was what to do, um, uh, paper dolls. My mother's aunt was quite a fine watercolorist of a certain sort. And during the Depression, my mother had the families lived together. My mother was the only girl of, there were four boy cousins and then her older brother who was favored, but her aunt painted these little paper dolls for all these sets. And I had played with them as a child, but I didn't really, my kids didn't really care too much about paper dolls, and they were very precious by then. So I actually have some of them framed just behind me. You can
Oh, look at
see
that. If only we could
those
see
are the
it.
ones of my mother.
Incredible.
Um, So, yes. So first I gave the paper dolls, and then that led to, one thing leads to another. Soon there's the diary, and then the letters, and now all of my mother's letters are there, and my letters are going to go there too. So my research.
Right. Well, so this is a good time to talk about different kinds of archives, right? I think, you make a point, you showed the slide of your father's ice pick of this, I think you've mentioned, you've referred to it as the material turn, this idea that moving, not biographers having a more capacious attitude toward archives, which is meaning not just paper archives, but archives of things. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it sounds like you, in your life as a biographer, starting with the Peabodys and moving now through ice picks and writing desks, have made a material turn yourself.
I have indeed. I think maybe it's something that happens as you get older too. You start valuing these objects that you've been carrying with you through your life. Actually, yeah, there are a number of things, and I have to say, I did find. I'm going to show you
Goody.
this. I did find. I thought I had lost it, but I talked about this Japanese box with the jewelry in it
Oh,
and that
lovely.
opens out in these different ways. Anyhow, it was in it was in a box in the back of my closet with some dolls that I've given now to the Mass Historical Society. I'm giving everything away, but I just do feel there's life in these things. If you don't let them overwhelm you, if you don't become a hoarder, as I have to say, there's a tendency towards that in my family. I was such a reader, as I say in the essay about these useless things. Once I started to read, it was like, I didn't even like having illustrations in the books I was reading. I wanted to imagine myself. I don't want to see this picture. And the writing of the Peabody sisters, Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Bishop, these were word people. And it was, the millions of letters that I read, or probably not millions, but many
Felt that
thousands.
way.
There wasn't a lot of description of things aside from that desk, which I'm not going to tell you how it ended up here, but it's in my office. I could tip my, you can sort of see it there. I'm sorry if I'm making you seasick. But uh, yes, I don't know, maybe there's a kind of sentimentality that overcomes you as you get older, but it is harder to, research that kind of story through an archive. A lot of the, writing about objects and their meaning to people are done by anthropologists, or archaeologists or art historians who are writing about objects. And that I did a lot of reading of that sort as I was working on that piece. But I realized it was a blind spot for me. And for many lives, that's all the documents there are. So that, there's this wonderful book by Taya Miles called All That She Carried about Ashley's sack, a sack that had been used perhaps for some kind of grain that was handed down through three generations of two generations of enslaved women, and then and this survived. So, so much could be told from that object, which is now on exhibit at the African American History Museum, the Smithsonian, in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Can be seen and imagined. You can imagine it becomes palpable. It's a great, I think maybe objects are better teaching tools. If you go to an exhibit at a historical society and all you're looking at is letters, that's not quite enough. Even though for me, I love reading the letters, hearing the voices, hearing the voices.
But you are someone, as am I, who have specialized in writing about women's lives. And the women that you have been the biographer for are unusual in that they have these voluminous written records.
Yes.
That's not true for most women's lives throughout history. I mean, the All That She Carried, the story of Ashley's sack is extrapolating enormous meaning from one object because there isn't anything else. So so let's talk a little bit about writing women's lives. You at the very beginning of the book, you have a wonderful line: "Dead men tell no tales, but dead women do. At least to me, they speak in questions." Can you discuss that a bit?
Yeah. Well, I think it must have to do with having, the generation that I grew up in. I was in college in the 70s, and it was still a time where it was rare to, in an English class to read any books written by women. I had, as I said, loved reading as a kid, and I was reading books about girls written by women. But, in my high school literature classes, in my college literature classes, and in the history classes, women weren't there. And I wanted to be there. And, a women's movement grew up around that loss and that effacement. And I wanted to be part of that. And it meant so much more to me than any other kind of direction of inquiry that I might have pursued. Um, and so I just, I wanted to know about women today. I wanted to know about women of the past. And they do speak to me, and they speak to you. It's a community of women that we're in. And I don't think I hear the voices of men as well. Not that my ears are shut to them. I really enjoyed so much writing about men as family men, Ralph Waldo Emerson in his family, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Horace Mann in their family. The sides that are usually, that they're not public facing and that you usually don't get. And of course, these women were in love with these men. They weren't useless sorts. They were doing
They were
what
the
they
good guys.
did. But you know them better if you know them from the perspective of the other people in the room, the other people at the table. If you see them at the kitchen table, at the dinner table, rather than just out there like Emerson giving his lectures, or
Right.
Nathaniel Hawthorne in the Custom House, as he presents himself in the prologue to the Scarlet Letter.
Right.
So
Right.
I liked answering the questions that seemed to emerge from, as you say, there wasn't in this case, there were letters and journals saved largely because they were involved with these famous men, which was another reason I was drawn because there were those letters. But there still were, there was very little published on the Peabody sisters, which was very, why it took so long to research and write that book.
Right. Right. Do you think there are challenges for women who want to do this kind of archival biographical work from the other side? Not just writing about women, but being the woman writing? Do you think there are challenges that, I
That
mean,
are specific to,
to being a woman writer, a woman writing women's lives?
well, when I started again in the 70s, there were no women in the history department at Harvard. I was a student there. There was one woman teaching a women's history class, but she was a lecturer in American studies, a very fine scholar who nurtured a number of women in the graduate program at Harvard who went on to become professors in various places. So there was definitely, that's not the case now at Harvard. There probably maybe at least as many women as men professors. And I will say I think the first woman tenured professor in any subject at Harvard was a history professor, Maud Cam, but that was long, long before. So, and I think there's, there are men in positions of power in all of these places who often just don't listen to women who are saying, this is what I want to do. This is what I think is interesting. This is what we ought to teach. I think that still goes on today.
Right.
And so we need to, um, wasn't women one of the banned words lately, I think.
Oh gosh, I hope
Um,
not.
anyway, let's keep at it. Let's
Yes.
hang on to Women's History Month. Don't let them take it away.
No.
And celebrate women every month of the year.
Every day. I was struck by a line in your essay about left-handed foremothers. You wrote, "I was forgetting the lesson I'd learned. Do not judge a woman, even a woman of ambition and capability, by her accomplishments. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, yes. Well, this maybe goes back to a better answer to your previous question, which is, women's lives have the complexity for many women of rearing children, and that can, uh,
Ah,
bringing that together with the working life is usually a greater challenge for women than for men. Doesn't have to be, but that's historically the way it is, and not enough has changed to help women. If we were in Japan, we'd have a year off for, maternity leave, but
mm,
we're not in Japan. So, um, and I think this was something I was struggling with in writing about the Peabody sisters, my own writing about them, that it was taking a very, very long time, kind of derailed by a lot that I was doing as far as taking care of my family. And it'd been a very long time. 20 years is a long time to work on something. And I really never was sure I'd finish until the end. And I had to think, was I a bad person if I never finished this? I
mm,
had to begin to evaluate myself in other ways. I had been a sort of high achieving person who never missed a deadline. And then I came up with the most difficult project in the world, and I was raising kids at the same time. So I
mm,
had to forgive myself in that way. But I was also really fascinated by, um, I'm not alone in that. So many of us have talents and capabilities that for one reason or another are not maybe fully realized, and
mm,
that does not mean we're bad people. We've failed, and we need to look at the whole picture. We need to look at the circumstances, and that's what I was doing by writing about the Peabody sisters. All three of whom you could say, well, if things were different, she might have been, a professor of history, or if things were different, she might have, run for governor instead of her husband, or if things were different, she
mm.
might have written the novels as well, or painted more pictures, that sort of thing. And things weren't different. And their lives are still valuable. And that's the story I wanted to tell in the
Right,
Peabody sisters.
right, right. So, so you are unique in having, maybe you're not unique, but you're unique to me in having written in all three modes. That the modes that I'm thinking of are biography, biography in which you play a part because you were in part there. That's the Elizabeth Bishop book because you were her student, and then memoir in this book. So which is most satisfying? Which is
Mhm.
scariest? Do you write differently depending
Mhm.
on which mode you're in?
I think my style has evolved. I'm very proud of each of the books, all of the books. And I guess I don't like to repeat myself. So even, I'm going around talking about my book, I can't say the same thing each time. Um, and it has to be different. And and so I think that's a lot of what was going on. It was a kind of evolution. And as I said, I come to this, I'm not a historian with a PhD. I'm not a English professor with a PhD. I came to this from out of journalism and literary criticism done for general readers. And that's the audience I write for. And writing was more important to me than necessarily than being a biographer, even though I have always been fascinated by lives of other people. And I believe very strongly in something that I found in a book by an early biographer, Gamaliel Bradford, who says we are all biographers from childhood, and that we're
Mhm.
always comparing our lives to the lives of other people around us. It's different to become a biographer, but I think we all have that biographical impulse in ourselves, and that's what I was building on as
Mhm.
I became a writer, thinking the curiosity about other lives and what we can learn from them.
Yeah. I, I I was surprised and then delighted to find have that once I published a book and then another book that you've told a story and then the frame kind of grows tendrils, and once the book is out in the world, people come back at you and say, here's another piece of the story that I know that you didn't know when you were writing. Have you found, now that this book is out in the world with these much more personal stories, that things are coming back at you, from family, from acquaintances, from perfect strangers with writing desks, that you didn't know, that are enlarging these stories?
Well, I did that the photograph of the lock of hair of Una's hair actually did come to me after the book came out, or after I'd finished that essay, and it's not actually that lock of hair that set me going. It's a different lock of hair, which I describe in the essay, but it is that was confirmation of Una's red hair. And another mystery to track down. Nobody really knows at what point that lock of hair was clipped, and how it reached the Clark family. Although I just was at the Mass Historical Society reading letters from Una Hawthorne to Lillian Clark, the daughter of James Freeman Clark, who had been a great friend of Margaret Fuller, and all of these people. He was a Unitarian minister. So I was hoping to find some similarity in the handwriting on that envelope to Lillian Clark, and maybe Una had given her clipping of hair to Lillian. I couldn't confirm that, but I found, gee, wouldn't you know? It happened that Una was in Concord at the time of Thoreau's death, so she describes his last months and the funeral to Lillian. So I don't think that would have made it into my essay, but I was excited to read it.
Right, right.
So
I think we maybe, oh, there's Margaret.
yes, I was going to read one last
yes,
just a couple
actually,
sentences, and this is just in closing. I mentioned the biographers from childhood. We are all biographers from childhood. Life is short, the ancient Dr. Hippocrates warned, and art is long, the pursuit of a craft and the lasting creation itself. So too is the art we make of lives.
that
So
is so beautiful. And I just learned a tremendous amount from both of you, about writing women's lives, about forging understanding through documents, how you come to understand people, and just the challenges that women face as writers and as readers and as daughters and granddaughters. And I'm enormously grateful to both of you. And also, your insight into women's lives and really the art that we are all making all the time. Janice and Megan, thank you so much.